would like to introduce Edward Butler, one of the most well-studied philosophers I know. He got his PhD from the New School for Social Research, an expert in ancient Greek and Hellenic and Neoplatonic philosophies, expert in also polytheistic cultures of as obscure, at least for me, cultures as ancient Egyptian religion. He has created an encyclopedia of which really I go to whenever I have a question about Egyptian gods or Egyptian rituals or Egyptian hierarchical or sacred history. Many times, whenever I find myself confounded by questions on Plato or Platonism and how Plato was received in the tradition, or for details on the ritual implications behind Greek texts, which I do not know, I go to Ed Butler. So it gives me a great deal of joy, Ed, to see you here and to congratulate you really on this panel. I would also like to acknowledge Harikiran Vadlamani, who is the force behind this. He made this book and this panel happen. Thank you very much, Hari. And thank you all also for joining. In my prepared comments, I will thank you again. But whatever plan now Ed wishes to have, would you like, you can speak in Ed.
Well, I had prepared a piece to introduce the book that perhaps might help to give people a sense of what they're really to look forward to from this piece, and then I guess I can hand it back over to the two of you for further remarks. But without further ado, Polytheism and Indology, which is my forthcoming book, is a celebration of the Ney science, a history of German Indology by Vishwa Adluri and Joydeep Bagchi, and a response to the challenge it poses. Its humble title notwithstanding, Adluri and Bagchi's book is no mere history, but is itself a historic moment in the Indian intellectual tradition's self-assertion in the global arena as no longer merely an object of study, but a producer of knowledge for itself and for the world. My book seeks to honor their work by standing on its shoulders. India arrived upon a European intellectual scene dominated by the spiritual crisis of monotheism, and its arrival, bearing an unbroken polytheistic tradition of unsurpassed antiquity and vibrancy, intensified that crisis. As such, the so-called scientific engagement with India on the part of Western academics, many of whom came more or less directly from the seminary, was hardly going to be carried out on a disinterested basis. Indeed, the Indologists studied in the Ney science were by no means shy about proclaiming their conviction of Christendom's religious and also racial superiority. The analysis and understanding of these Indological tactics remains crucial for India's intellectual and spiritual future, inasmuch as no sea change has occurred in Indology that would render the strategies of German Indology in the late 19th and early 20th century a matter of mere history. The purpose of my book is twofold. First, to facilitate the ongoing project of analyzing and confronting Indology's ideological components by making the basic results of the Ney science available to those who may not require their full evidentiary basis. And second, to expand upon those results, broadening and deepening the inquiry. I am aided in this task by my own work on Platonism, on the metaphysics of polytheism, and on the theologies and philosophies of several ancient and contemporary polytheistic civilizations. The effect of this widened scope is the recognition that the issues brought to the surface through the critique of Indology go to the very core of the Western tradition and its unresolved struggle with the polytheistic traditions at its foundation. This antagonism has not remained buried in the past, but rather has continued to drive intellectual developments in the West for the last 1,500 years, ever since the struggle between polytheist Platonic philosophers and the politically dominant Christianity was forcefully terminated by legislation in 529 CE forbidding non-Christians from public teaching. As a result, philosophical instruction at the great academies of Athens and Alexandria, the centers of philosophical thought in the Western world, essentially ceased. This brought to an end the ancient Hellenic philosophical tradition, nearly 1,000 years old at that point, which had been born in and nurtured by a polytheistic religious context, first in Greece itself, and then on an increasingly international stage in the wake of Alexander's conquests, and which, beginning with Plotinus in the 3rd century CE, had rallied to the defense of polytheism against those who, as Plotinus puts it, contract the divine into one. For the next 2 centuries, Platonists fashioned an international philosophical tradition, inclusive to an unprecedented degree, welcoming thinkers of many nations, incorporating their philosophical opponents and predecessors, and informed by and supportive of the greatest possible variety of theophanies, from those predating Hellenic civilization, such as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian, to traditions having only recently emerged, such as that of the so-called Chaldean oracles. Indeed, it's clear from thinkers like Synesius that the Platonic synthesis, given a chance, would have accommodated Christians as well, albeit as equals, not as the supreme or sole theophany. But once the militant voices of great philosophers of the Platonic tradition, such as Proclus and Damascius, had been silenced, Christians were free to make what they wished of this inclusive tradition, deciding what of it survived and what it had all meant from its very beginnings, without anyone to criticize their interpretations. The philosophical and theological legacy of antiquity, the work of polytheists, would be until our own day whatever monotheists said it was. The influence of so-called pagan philosophy upon Christianity and Islam was undoubtedly salutary, a leavening influence in dark times. The restored access to the texts of the great thinkers of Hellenic polytheist antiquity that began in the 13th century brought profound intellectual and spiritual turmoil to the Latin West, at the same time that it stimulated revolutions in the arts and sciences. This turmoil reached its culmination in the encounter with living polytheistic civilizations in Asia, Africa, the Americas, Australia, and Oceania. In some cases, the intellectual achievements of these civilizations were impossible for Westerners to suppress entirely, as disturbing as they were to their worldview. This was the case in vast nations such as India and China, which were able to sustain their cultural integrity in the colonial encounter to a degree that indigenous peoples in the Americas, sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, and Oceania, overwhelmed or enslaved, could not. The suppression of polytheism in these cases, therefore, a goal which had by no means been forsaken by the doyens of enlightenment, had to be undertaken by different means, in addition to force of law and direct evangelization. The rise of the humanities in modernity was shaped by this project, whether the philological disciplines, such as Indology, or the new discipline of classics, the new historicist approaches to philosophy, the new science of anthropology, all took as their presupposition the inherent superiority of monotheism and bent themselves to the task of undermining continuous polytheistic traditions, as well as policing the interpretation of the works of polytheist antiquity. Their global procedure consisted in undermining native interpretive traditions, severing the bonds between ongoing religious life and sacred texts, undermining the unity of philosophical insight and religious enlightenment, displacing philosophy as a mediator between traditions in favor of historicist and materialist approaches, opposing diverse aspects of the same tradition to one another to dissolve its integrity, and promoting the idea of an evolution of religions toward monotheism of an increasingly purified and universal character. This program has been carried out wherever the Western Academy has been confronted with the works of polytheistic civilizations, ancient or contemporary, with different emphases depending upon the peculiarities of the situation. Hence, in India's case, the discovery of affinities among the languages of the Indo-European family sparked a desire to align the project of monotheist dominion with the quest for an Aryan racial identity, so that the Mahabharata, in particular, was dismembered in the search for traces of an ancient race of Indo-Germanic conquerors, of whom Indologist Christian Lawson remarked that their, quote, Western racial relatives are even now successfully fighting a similar battle with similar superiority over the red races of America, unquote. The Nayscience traced these racist themes in German Indology, as well as critiquing Indology's positivist scientific orientation. My book argues that a logic imminent to monotheism has led, not coincidentally, to both racist and positivist materialisms, to the alienated psychological subject of modernity, as well as the alienated ecological subject of the contemporary environmental crises. Polytheism and Indology seeks to illuminate the promise that a renewed intellectual engagement with polytheism holds for the future of the social sciences, a project to which India, due to the exceptional integrity of its own traditions, proves indispensable. And so with that, I can hand it over now to Joy, perhaps, for your remarks.
I'm not going to read my prepared statement because Wishes is far more elegant. This is something I often suffer from being an editor of his work. It becomes very difficult for me to write or to accept my own writings. I think you've stated the case more clearly and more brilliantly.
Would you like to read my remarks and make that from both of us, so we will, in the interest of time, then we can just have a discussion.
You want to spare voice. All I wanted to say is that I always appreciate the way Ed sort of cuts through the BS and puts it so elegantly and clearly. And part of that comes from his ability to sort of work in an intellectual space that is not tainted by sort of the scholars of religion that you and I have to deal with. And we always have to find these complex ways of teasing it out and saying it in sort of equivocal ways and sort of implicit ways, whereas you come out and say, look, this is just Christianity and this is all that's happening. It's just a monotheistic reduction happening. And yeah, in a sense, we all know that, but that's why the whole complexity of Nayscience was required. Let me now read Vish's comments. They are open, but I have to find the right window. So I have them in front of me. I can still see all of you.
Well, Ed, I send the comments to you. If you wish to publish them somewhere, make sure that you run it by me because I would need to add a bibliography. Okay.
So these are comments on Dr. Butler's book, Polytheism and Indology. I met Ed Butler at the New School for Social Research in what was an intensely intellectual environment permeated by the voices and spirits of Hannah Arendt, Hans Jonas, and Rainer Schurman. I was working on Parmenides and Plato, and Ed was working on Proclus and Neoplatonism. In a university setting where contemporary continental philosophy, preferably in its latest incarnation, dominated, there were few students with whom we could discuss ancient philosophy. Thus began our friendship. Ed Butler, I discovered, had an aptitude for understanding systems of thought I found alien, the French Neoplatonists of the last century, for example. But there was more than an antiquarian interest in arcane areas of study. For us, exploring the ancients meant to live creatively and think uncompromisingly at the end of modernity. This end of modernity was existentially present in the philosophers we all revered at our university, intellectuals who had fled Europe in the mid-20th century. All illusions of rationality, ethics, aesthetics, and humanity were covered in dark shadows of the events. My own teacher, Rainer Schurmann, puts it succinctly: all that European humanity has made of itself in the first half of the 20th century, and all that it is in the process of doing to itself on a planetary scale in the second half that makes darkness so familiar to us, must have distant and profound origins. The ease with which a whole age nonetheless continues to graze in spite of exterminations still alive in our memories and planetary asphyxiations already in our throats gives grounds for perplexity. To think is to linger on the conditions in which one is living, to linger on the site where we live. Thus, to think is a privilege of that epoch which is ours, provided that the essential fragility of the sovereign reference becomes evident to it. This assigns to philosophy, or to whatever takes its place, the task of showing the tragic condition beneath all principled constructions. In tracing what European humanity has made of itself and is doing on a planetary scale, philosophy becomes critical and investigates the principled constructions, that is, the intellectual hegemonies that underscore the dehumanization and destruction to which our age has handed itself. To become critical is to refuse to graze on an episteme that has ceased to humanize us. All New School students are thus given a critical ethical mandate. Three of us, Ed, myself, and Joydeep Bagchi, thus wish most of all to see how European humanities became what they did and analyze the reasons for their collapse. The most existential need was to abandon the intellectual topos of a worn-out and hence trite modernity. We fled forward and backward, forward led by Nietzsche and the problem of Heidegger, and backward into the thought worlds of the pre-Socratics, Homer, Plato, Neoplatonists, and finally the Mahabharata. The youngest of us, Dr. Bagchi, was already beyond the struggles of modernity. The models of thought that had crashed for Ed Butler and me were already ghosts to him. These personal remarks about the authors of the Nay Science are meant to contribute to understanding our work. They are not meant to only eulogize our friendship with sentimentality. Let me quote, so this is the second part, hegemony and history. Let me quote another scholar, Catherine Nixey, writing on a more personal note. It was the church, they told me, that had kept alive the Latin and Greek of the classical world in the benighted Middle Ages until it could be picked up again by the wider world in the Renaissance. On holidays, we would visit museums and libraries where the same point was made. As a young child, I looked at the glowing gold of the illuminated manuscripts and believed in a more metaphorical illumination in ages of intellectual darkness. And in a way, my parents were right to believe this, for it is true. Monasteries did preserve a lot of classical knowledge, but it is far from the whole truth. In fact, this appealing narrative has almost entirely obscured an earlier, less glorious story. For before it preserved, the church destroyed. In a spasm of destruction never seen before, and one that appalled many non-Christians watching it, during the 4th and 5th centuries, the Christian church demolished, vandalized, and melted down a simply staggering quantity of art. Classical statues were knocked from their plinths, defaced, defiled, and torn limb from limb. Temples were razed to their foundations and mutilated. A temple widely considered to be the most magnificent in the entire empire was leveled. Many of the Parthenon sculptures were attacked, faces were mutilated, hands and limbs were hacked off, and gods were decapitated. Some of the finest statues in the whole building were almost certainly smashed off, then ground into rubble that was then used to build churches. Books which were often stored in temples suffered terribly. The remains of the greatest library in the ancient world, a library that once held perhaps 700,000 volumes, were destroyed in this way by Christians. It was over a millennium before any other library could even come close to its holdings. Works by censured philosophers were forbidden, and bonfires blazed across the empire as outlawed books went up in flames. The complicated story of Christianity's interface, so that's the end of the quote, the complicated story of Christianity's interface with pagan cultures involved not only preservation and creation of new hybrid cultures, but also destruction. Ed Butler's interpretation of the Nescience succinctly articulates this destructive aspect, applying our analysis of German Indology to a larger history of Christianity's triumphal narrative. In fact, the narrative of triumph itself is encoded into history in a twofold manner. One, the overcoming of the old covenant, the supersession of Judaism by Christianity as the new revelation, and two, the overcoming of all cultures by Protestantism, a historical progress narrative presented by Hegel in the form of world history. Hence, to understand the humanities today is to see the essential historicism as its chief intellectual foundation and to question that foundation. It need not be stated explicitly that accusing this intellectual project of somehow misunderstanding history or attributing it to ignorance of historicism and its methods is prejudice of the most banal and frankly racist kind. So, part 3, History and the Institution. Historicism, that is the reduction of all knowledge to historical data, is unthinking and therefore profane. The humanities cannot simultaneously reduce all wisdom to material transactions, ultimately to the political, and claim any role in noetic emancipation. If priests, rabbis, Brahmins, and philosophers are explained away as determined by historical political processes, the theorist no longer holds any privileged position. The explanans themselves become an explanandum. The conceit of the professoriate is that it alone has transcended bad faith, while denying all forms of transcendence as ideology begs the question. Thus, the humanities now operate in an economy of identities rather than an economy of ideas. How did such a change happen? To study this is to subject historicism itself to criticism. But the academic institution of humanities bases itself on an episteme whose rationale can be stated bluntly. The humanities are like the natural sciences. Both are method-based. The method of the natural sciences, the experimental hypothetical deductive method, is unfit for studying human Geist and hence requires a different, superior method, the historical method. Thus, the critique of historicism requires mutatis mutandis, a critique of the humanities, and a critique of humanities necessarily requires a critique of Christianity. And this is just what Nietzsche did. His opinio juris sive necessitatis, God is dead. The critique of the humanities, the historical mooring and Christian foundations, is already undertaken by Nietzsche. The death of God is revealed by a figure eerily reminiscent of Diogenes, a madman carrying a lantern to a group of men eerily reminiscent of contemporary academics in their obtuseness and their superciliousness. Nietzsche separately and together critiqued the components of this episteme. All we have done is verified his diagnosis. Ed has understood the Nietzschean project of the Nescience intimately, for he begins his book with a nod to Nietzsche. There was only one norm, man, and every people thought that it possessed this one ultimate norm. But above and outside in some distant overworld, one was permitted to behold a plurality of norms. One God was not considered a denial of another God, no blasphemy against him. This is Nietzsche, The Gay Science, Aphorism 143, the greatest advantage of polytheism. From his earliest ruminations on the future of our academic institutions and we philologists to his late works against Christianity, Nietzsche is critiquing the collapse of academic humanities, not as an enemy, but as a physician. And this is the fourth and actually it's not the final. From the clergy to the gods, polytheism as an intellectual turn. Because of the nature of this panel, I cannot spell out fully the dimensions of the critique undertaken in Polytheism and Indology. However, I wish to emphasize that though Ed has been an intellectual forerunner, his critique and ours does not hang in the air. All the pieces of the argument have been made. They were evident for those who did not want to persist in denial. One, that the humanities are somehow secular, or two, that they can humanize without some reference to what is ultimately their Christian, biblical, moral, soteriological heritage. Let me list them briefly for those unfamiliar with the two books. The Protestant basis of the German University, Tal Howard, the treason of the academic clergy, Julian Bender, the anti-Semitism at the basis of historicism and university life, Husserl and Mahler had to convert to Protestantism before being appointed, the failure of academic humanities to humanize us, Karner-Ross, the shame of the graduate schools, Arrowsmith, the critique of the German academic as an endangered Mandarin class, Ringer, the development of the vocation of the professoriate as a caste, Weber, the origin of text historical method in Protestantism and its anti-Semitism, Zemler, the Protestant cover of History of Religion and Comparative Religion, J.Z. Smith and Tillich, the extinction event of academia, Andrew Kay. So what is new and necessary, as Butler correctly points out, is the evidentiary basis for avoiding orthodox self-serving academic dodges. 1, the text historical method is Wissenschaft. It was no such thing. 2, the method is developing. Past problems do not preclude future innovation. 3, one can be eclectic. Even in the bad philologies, there is something interesting or useful. I could dilate on these dodges, but the point of our analysis is to demonstrate that in at least one sub-discipline, Nietzsche's critique cannot be dodged. There was no science, no method, no argument, no progress, and nothing ethical, aesthetic, philosophical, or redemptive about Indology. It was a groupthink, a cult, whose entire corpus could be reduced without remainder to its Protestant evangelical prejudices and projects, and the petty bureaucratic concerns of its chosen few. As Butler remarks, Indology is a canary in the coal mines of humanities, and this canary reveals that the humanities are not merely sick or progressing or in need of revivification by further NEH funding. Indology is dead. Other fields of the humanities would do well to pay attention. And this is the final short paragraph, Polytheism and Philosophy. Ed Butler's work truly exploits, I am happy to say, the consequences of the naissance by robustly reframing our critique of Lutheran anti-philosophical prejudices in a radical new way. If we are to think beyond academic prejudices, we must, at least as argument and disputatio, renew debates that were not settled but silenced by the text historical method. It is now up to the professoriate to accept the challenges Ed Butler poses. Why should divinity be considered one alone, when economy of explanation, philosophical thinking, and a greater history, one that does not talk down to the ancients, recommend otherwise? Is faith really sufficient for making the world ethical through the intervention of the humanities? Since the prejudices underlying the humanities in the present form are truly dead, along with their supreme referent, God, what new methods does the professoriate have to offer? To renew a dialogue with polytheism is nothing more and nothing less than to be concerned with the survival of the humanities. The emancipation of the humanities from the underhanded Christianity, slave morality, and smug Philistinism of 19th century German academics is only the first step in this attempt to reclaim the great insights and classics of antiquity. That was the whole text. Thank you.
Oh, that was...
You're muted.
Very stimulating. You know, I mean, I always derive so much pleasure from the way in which Professor Ed Lurie and yourself frame things. Let me see. The question of how to proceed. I would say this. We could, in order to bring our interests more into a common space, perhaps we could orient our discussion around this question of the humanities and of the human. And the question which has come up in previous panels today about the importance of both the non-human in order to have a conception of the human which is humane, so to speak, to the human, we need a conception of the non-human. And we need more than just a conception of it. We in some fashion need to bring the voice of the non-human into the dialogue in order that the dialogue should even be a dialogue among humans, let's say. And so I think that for me, what guided me in writing this book was my sense that perhaps the case of Indology was a kind of a bottleneck where as Vishwa pointed out in that text, where the insufficiencies of a positivist scientific method with respect to the products of the human spirit, let's say, became particularly salient and came up unavoidably, I think, against a living tradition that that could not be stopped from speaking back. Because I think that what one sees in the impact that Indian civilization had on European civilization from the 18th century on, and not just in terms of academics, where we see a process of increasing professionalization and increasingly shutting down the engagement with Indian texts by people who are not sanctified as the appropriate scientific professionals to deal with these texts with their apparatus, so to speak, to contain the contagion, so to speak. But the broader circle of readers, including movements like Theosophy and so forth, and I mean, this is very much evident in the United States as well. This kind of impact, these texts, they spoke back. They couldn't be silenced. And I think that I see this in the context of, in a number of other areas as well, the voices of a non-human element forcing itself into the discourse. And so I guess I'd just like to put that out there to see what you might think about this kind of question of the constitution of a discourse about the human through the participation of the non-human, the participation of gods, of other animals, of the natural world, natural forces, and of course, most importantly, of the incredible diversity of human cosmogonies and the incredible diversity of this cosmogonic activity.
Vishwa, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I would like to simply say that the ancient Greeks, up to Aristotle, did not proceed to give a definition of a human being. Anthropos, for Aristotle, is an animal with reason, but reason in Aristotle is something divine. It is not simply calculative thinking or syllogistic logic. In fact, for Aristotle, God is thought thinking itself. So, this I am opposed to, or at least I'm critiquing this idea of defining a human in a privileged way and making that definition of human the pinnacle of all explanations and all existence. This anthropocentricity is violent. It is unnecessary. It is impoverishing, except perhaps to glut consumption through technology and exploitation. And finally, it is deadly, as the climate change, and so on demonstrate. But even before climate change, already 20th century was shuddering in bloodshed. And before that, in the 18th century, there were already global colonizations where other humans were reduced to material. So the definition of human as the center point and as the goal of all creation deserves to be thought. And if divinity be introduced merely as a limit to this grotesque anthropocentrism, then we should explore that avenue carefully.
I saw that Stephanus had a hand up. If yes, would you like to?
Yeah.
Yes.
Not to hopefully intrude too much on this excellent conversation, but my own academic training, my doctoral work was in Celtic studies, and if I haven't read Dr. Bogchi and Dr. Udluri's book yet, nor yours, Edward, but if it looks bad from the viewpoint of Indology, Celtic studies is a global fucking disaster, because the people who, two groups of people were kind of the golden age, quote unquote, Celticists, right? German philologists, and one of the most important Celticists of the late 1800s is a guy called Whitley Stokes. And Whitley Stokes was a colonial administrator from Ireland who lived and worked in India for many years. And, these are the people who shaped this field. And one of the things about Celtic studies is the monotheist assumptions, the humanistic assumptions, logical positivism, all of this kind of thing, the interest in wanting to reconstruct the beliefs rather than looking at the practices which still do come through and taking them seriously in the texts that still do exist, and so on and so forth down the line, has been done in the confidence that there is no living culture to speak back, that the texts do not speak back except through highly trained philologists, which the first time somebody called me a philologist, I took it both as a compliment and also the highest insult simultaneously that I'd ever received. But yeah, the confidence that these things don't speak back, that the deep tradition in Ireland, for example, of place name lore, which gives, as a young grad student from Harvard in the last decade has said, a genealogy of landscape. This permeates medieval Irish literature, and that's that's the voice of the land, in many ways speaking for itself. And yet this agency of the land, that idea is just so alien to this group of people. So yeah, I mean, there are so many things that could be applied from the work that you've been doing to, I suspect, every other branch of philology that exists, certainly in Indo-European quote unquote studies, with all of the white supremacist baggage of that field as well. So yeah, I mean, this is it's exciting and important and just, excellent work. And I want to applaud all of you for doing this. And it also demonstrates how much so many of these questions are just absolute and utter blind spots, particularly when I regularly witness, my academic seniors with tenure at all of the great universities, literally going, ha, 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 to the idea that there are modern polytheists, or true believers, as they call them. And it's like, no, how about practitioners? That's what they are. You're the true believers in something that you all made up and have so distorted with the lenses that you don't even realize are myopic. So anyway, all of that to say, thank all of the gods for all of what you are doing in this work, because, we need to highlight all of those cracks in the academic edifice, because they are there and it's falling away and they don't even realize it. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I think that I think it's so. If we had experts from any number of different fields, I think that they could tell a similar story, different in one way or another, given the specificities of the field, but with so many common elements. And this is what motivated me in the book, was just from the familiarity that I had with a couple of areas in which I was either a specialist or a very interested layperson, let's say, an informed and critical consumer of scholarly literature on a number of polytheist civilizations, ancient and modern. I think what I was struck by when I first read the Nescience, and I vividly remember from the very first time that I read it, this feeling that, yes, this is a story that actually has taken place in all of these different fields. It's like an octopus that is present in so many different fields that came of age during the same time, under the same kind of pressures, with the same kinds of institutional structures, and that resulted in very similar effects on the scholarship. And we could do this with reference to so many fields. And my hope is that by sketching the kind of broader argument, as I have in this book, that specialists in their own fields will be able to recognize for themselves the way in which these forces have been felt within their field, and will be able to themselves then take forward the critique within their field, as only they are really equipped to do so, as insiders, so to speak. Let me recognize Theanos Thrax with a question or comment.
There's also a question in the question window from Arun Narayan.
let me just see. Thanks for the discussion. It appears the universities stand between the humans and gods. Considering the universities in STEM cannot be wished away, going forward, how can we shape the humanities within the universities? Well, let me, as a sort of a longtime outsider of the university system myself, ever since I got my degrees, I think that I would kind of pass that question over to Vishwa and Joydeep to perhaps comment a little bit on what you see as the kind of the kind of game plan going forward within the university, given the kind of stringent critique that both of you have of the university structure of the humanities. What do you see as let's say the most practical aspect of the program that you could speak to? And then we'll pick up Thrax's question.
Everyone knows and everyone recognizes that the way the humanities have developed and been structured, along with increasing professionalization, they have also become a guild unto themselves, a sort of club or a sort of cult unto themselves. And it is those who are willing to engage in this cult and master its techniques and play its ritual games who thrive. And everyone I know in my lifetime, everyone with a genuine love of learning, with passion for the ancients or for texts, or even people who wanted to just do English literature, again and again, you read Chronicle of Higher Education, the same thing is being said, that I thought when I joined a PhD program, I loved literature. I ended up hating it. They made me hate it. Do not join the program because this is not what we do. We do not read great books. Everyone knows that this cultic structure exists, that it is no longer about the ancients, it's no longer about the primary text. It's about a sort of superficial veneer of knowing the secondary literature and then knowing how to navigate the sort of conference structure and the publishing structure and networking. The first question that anyone asks me at a conference is where I am. And then they try and find out if there's some kind of reciprocal favor I can do for them, if I can invite them, if I can create a lecture series, if I can pay for an airline ticket. And when I say, I don't have those resources, but you can come and stay with me in Berlin. It's a small apartment, but it's central, and we can have intellectual conversations. They're not interested because they're not pursuing the life of the mind. The humanities are dying, and it's a very, very good thing because STEM is real. STEM actually produces real knowledge, real consequences, real technologies, real solutions. And it is what the wealth of the United States, for example, or any country for that matter, even Germany's technological prowess is the source of its wealth. The humanities were always parasitic on that. They were a rider on that. And they kind of sucked off real wealth and transferred it to people that I think do not necessarily have creative or aesthetic tendencies. Let me just give you one example. The US federal government, we know most of the large universities in the US are land grant universities. The US federal government transferred 17 million acres of land to the land grant universities. Some of that was kept as campuses, but a lot of it was sold to make money for the university and create an endowment. That land never belonged to the federal government, right? We all know that. It's Native American unceded territory. So now you have virgin land, masses of it with timber, whatever, natural resources that is being transferred to institutions that are basically enormous bastions of white privilege and have created an arcane system for hiring their own kind. This is simply a transfer of wealth away from communities to a white privileged class, and everyone knows that Black scholars are not hired, persons of color are not hired. So this is how privilege gets entrenched. This is why the end of the humanities is really to be welcomed, as an opportunity for thought, but also as an opportunity for equality. and thirdly, as an opportunity for restitution to those who were disenfranchised through the university. That's all I have to say about that. I hope that answers it.
Wow, that was dynamite.
Okay.
That was an incredibly incisive analysis, and I think really a model for how to engage in the analysis of institutions and their genealogy as a way of disrupting them in the present. I think that was just dynamite. All right. Let me pick up Thrax's question and or comment, however, and we'll just keep this rolling.
So I don't know how to follow that. As a byproduct of the humanities, who's in complete agreement with what was just said, because that's what I was doing throughout my time in the humanities, and it's why I'm not. It's why I've turned down opportunities to teach at universities. I don't want to be involved in what they want the furtherance of my fields to be. So I'm not doing that because I will not be party to that. And I've been constantly trying to find an avenue of circumnavigating some of those, to put it lightly, hiccups, to put it very lightly. But that's not what my original hands up flag was about. I wanted to respond originally to the prior comments around anthropocentrism is violent. It is deadly. And this is an element that is the core of everything that I do. And it probably didn't shine through that way in my work today that I presented, because my presentation is around human identity orientation dynamics. And so it probably sounds as though I'm very human-centered. I am the furthest from that you could get, but rather I'm interested in managing the human problem in order to navigate away from some of those, again, to downplay it in a term, those hiccups. And anthropocentrism is not only violent, it is cancerous, and it is contagious. It spreads between disciplines. It spreads between premises of thought which often begin in a good way, but then circle back and have lost whatever flurry they began with. And I work more with, so I'm a devotional polytheist. Most of my life is mystic stuff and devotion, and I don't talk a whole lot about that in my academic work because it doesn't translate well to my academic work. My academic disciplines don't have language for it. But where I do have language for these dynamics is in my work with animals. And I work with animals extensively. And so we, in our polytheistic communities internationally, we speak a lot of non-human personhood or other than human personhood. And when we're describing anthropocentrism and the dangers therein and the damage or destruction therein, it is, I think, an easy, slippery slope dynamic to then proceed onward thinking that what we're talking about is extreme abstractions or gods that only a precious few will ever encounter. But I work with literally biologically present non-human entities who hold personhood and intelligence and responsivity and learning and engagement. In fact, one of them is currently screeching in the background at me right now because I'm speaking again for the first time in a few hours, so I apologize if my mic's picking that up. But in my
not at all. Don't hear it.
Good. In my lecture series on this, one of the encounters that I describe is, and I hope this isn't too tangential, but sometime around 2008, I had a dream, and it was following a fairly involved 22-hour-long ritual devotion And then I went to sleep, as we all eventually do, and I had a dream of a species of snake that I had never encountered and did not know to exist. And one of my deities very specifically taught me about them, told me about them, but called them by words that I had never encountered and that don't exist, that aren't real. It was a dream, and I distinguish between dreams with a lowercase d and dreams with a capital D. And sometimes it's very clear which is which. Sometimes it's less so. Was this just staggering exhaustion? Or was I having a dream? Was I receiving? And the very next day, within hours of waking up, there was a person desperate in the animal rescue world to place two particular constrictor serpents of a CITES listed endangered species that were in a breeding circulation in the US pet scene. So exotic, bad animal breeding, the most inhumane conditions you can imagine, and they needed to be placed somewhere immediately. And this was just one of 1,000 emails, but I clicked it, looked through it, and the animals in the images, which was a species of constrictor I'd never seen before, they were what I had dreamed. So with no second thought, I put the money together. I arranged all the shipment, and for shipping and arranging the transport and safe and humane handling of large animals, this is not cheap, especially last minute. And they were immediately given place within my temple. And they were wonderful. And I'll skip through all of that to get to the key of this, which is that maybe 2 years later, I had concluded a number of rituals in the temple that night. I was done. Again, multi-hours. I was exhausted. I'm a disabled person, usually working understaffed or alone. I was tired. And the animals that work with me in my religions, they're participants, and they are, especially in this particular elevated case, they are treated as clergy. And so it is less that I am using animals in my religion as I am assisting in the participation of their religion. And I wound up, after everything was said and done, I wasn't feeling good, and I took my temperature, and I had a fever of 106. So I went to bed, and I had horrible fever dreams. And in the dreams, there was fire, there was badness, there was apocalyptic stuff, the usual stuff you have with fever. But one of the key things was there were these two large constrictor serpents, and they were enveloping all of the world, but they carried my temple on their backs. And it was this beautiful thing. I wound up, whenever it was that I woke up, stumbling back to the temple, unlocking the door and going in, because I was convinced that something was wrong and that the temple was about to burn down. There was this imminent, I had not properly closed their enclosures when I departed. And they were both sitting in their respective enclosures, which are large, spacious environments. And they just had their heads rested on what amounts to the door frame, just waiting for me. And I came back into the temple hours later, and they had no reason to have not left. They had no reason to have not knocked all the sacred icons and statues off of all of the shrines. They just waited, because they had already sent me the message and waited for me to return, because I wasn't there using them in my religion. We were partners in what was very much more their religion than mine. And so we spent time together afterwards, and my fever had broken. I was doing reasonably better, but they both came out. And then I had two giant, large, 14-foot constrictors upon me, and it was lovely and wonderful and sacred, but also just mundane. just hugs, just them making sure I was okay. Then they put themselves away, and I made sure everything was closed up, and that stays with me. I work with animals every day. It's part of what I do. But I hear a lot of people talk about anthropocentrism and about the dynamics and dangers and pitfalls of being human-centric. And I think in some respect, it means something different for me because so much of my work is so specifically not about humans. Now, I also do mental health consultation. I work in politics. I work in this. I'm doing the human stuff too. But when it comes to the ritual, when it comes to the devotion, when it comes to the religion, I am there with them far more than I have ever felt myself there with other humans. And so how do we take this idea, this knowledge that we have, that human-centric ideas, that the idea of human relatability as center to our cosmos, to our ethics, how do we apply that in a manner for those that can't work in that temple with those serpents? How do we help the others who are not in that position?
I think that to begin with, I think that having just this kind of conversation that we're having is exactly, I think, where we need to start. And I think to me, the really salient point that you make is this notion that you're participating in their religious experience. You're not using them, instrumentalizing them in a religious experience of yours. You are participating in the coming forth of a religious space for them. And I think that, of course, people are going to say that all kinds of issues of discernment come up here, and issues of projection, of anthropomorphism. But this is how we begin to speak beyond the human on behalf of a wider and a deeper humanity. Because I think that in order for if it's not just going to be the case that the humanities died and good riddance, as Joy was saying, if there's to be a purpose to them, I think that the conception of the human needs to, in a sense, transcend the taxonomically human. It needs to transcend the taxonomical humanity, which is merely a contingent circumstance of a certain evolutionary history, and needs instead to encompass something broader, that in this broader sense, everything is human to the degree that it is able to come forward and be welcomed as its own center of its own universe. And this makes humanity a project, not something which is simply conferred in advance, but a project that humans in the narrow taxonomical sense and all kinds of non-human entities are coming together into a space of engagement and working toward. And so that sense of working toward being human, rather than presupposing a certain humanity, I think is the sense in which we get beyond anthropocentrism, and we work our way toward some concept of the humanities that would be more humane, as I say, more nourishing to actual beings.
I also think that one of the things we cannot get avoid is having some kind of critique of desire, because really what modernity has done is sort of broken every restriction on desire, whether it be the Catholic Lent, or desire itself is seen as a good and a positive value, and is identified with the human being. A man is what he desires, rather than, as in the Platonic tradition, desire is something that pulls you away from yourself, it alienates you, it degrades you, which is also there in the Indian tradition, that desire is fundamentally alienating and degrading. We have come to accept desires as natural and identify with them with rights. So not only do I desire X, but I am identified with my desire, and since I as a person have certain inalienable rights, then my desire is also righteous. And therefore I'm just justified in taking land if I want it, or driving a truck or an SUV or something. And it is not sustainable. We have brought the planet to the verge of collapse, and every tradition that somehow says there must be a hierarchic structure to society, there must be limits, not everyone can be. We are living in a situation where everyone is the king, everyone is a god, and is sort of riding a chariot like a god on earth. It's not sustainable. And yet in academia, I find repeatedly a constant critique of any society that puts limits on the individual, as though the individual simply in his unbridled desires, is his parvenu nature, is simply the sort of, and they don't make that connection between our humanities are proposing a certain ideal of the good life and the ideal of the emancipated individual. And then there's the ecological catastrophe, and they're not making the connection that the kind of human we are positing is the human responsible for that catastrophe. Now they want, of course, in the language of self-righteousness and woke and Thunberg and all these, they want to propose that same human now is somehow going to once again turn Christian and take over care for the earth. It's not going to work.
I would like to have two clarificatory remarks, if possible. One is what Professor Bagchi and I mean when we critique humanities is that we do not critique literature, we do not critique scripture, we do not critique poetry, music, art. In fact, everything the humanities presents as civilization was created outside the university. And it was meant for the edification and enjoyment of the public. The university, in a way, inserted itself in the form of this episteme, and the episteme created an ivory tower in which literature, art, music, taste, everything is held captive. So by saying, as critiquing humanities, we by no means wish to critique human creativity. Rather, we wish to set it free and remove these this undergrid. And that undergrid, what is that undergrids this epistemic prison in which human creativity is trapped? I think Dr. Butler's book brings that out very clearly in Polytheism and Indology. And I applaud his style in that book, because it's not the same dry academic style of my work or Dr. Bagchi's work, in his ability to place these complex criticisms as well as suggestions. He does an outstanding job with the book. The book is very readable, approachable, and I mean, neither Ed Butler nor I, nor Bakshi are critiquing Christianity itself or any religion itself. In fact, it would be contrary to the polytheistic position to deny or exclude any faith form. However, politically, 19th century Christian Europe colonized and ruled the entire planet, barring less than 5% of inhabited land. So there is a need for a critique of this Christian episteme, which is enshrined in the humanities, in a way other religions, including other monotheisms such as Islam, is not guilty of. Or is not an epistemic blinder on this. So we should, so those were the clarifications I wanted to make.
Yeah, and very, very important ones. I would add, certainly for my own part, that while I'm very critical of the institutionalization of Christianity, as I said in the piece that I read at the beginning, under different institutional circumstances, under a different institutional setting, it's plain to me, and we can see from thinkers like Synesius, that Christianity could have entered into a peaceful coexistence with the other religions in its environment, and indeed would have, without a great deal of heavy-handed intervention, in order to prevent such a synthesis emerging. The potential for this sort of peaceful coexistence is by no means has by no means disappeared from the world. Rather,
no, this is a sorry to interrupt. This is this is the project of dialogue between Dr. Butler, Dr. Bakshi, and myself, which is basically that there have been these concerted attempts to actually make such a synthesis itself an anathema. So, for example, in the ancient world, and Butler points out in his book that such syntheses were not possible. And if you look at the Reformation project by Luther, of course, we have respect for him as a church father, latter-day church father. We nevertheless see that the reformist project was against the admixture or the purification of Christianity from its philosophical and its traditional moorings.
Also from its moorings.
Also what?
Also from its Jewish moorings.
Yeah. So this idea of reform in the humanities now, we're not talking about a faith anymore. In the arena of reformation, in the arena of humanities, this reformation zeal has become unsustainable. It has lapsed into hysterical righteousness and mindless dismissal of all kinds of contrary voices, dialectical or dialogical voices. And humanities cannot exist without opening it up for dialogue. And if we are only talking to ourselves in the university, then why should the public pay for us to exist? So that's that. So I appreciate Professor Bagchi's point about the university as much as I appreciate Professor Ed Butler's, Professor Ed Butler's point about a need for a Christian critique. This did not come up, the issue of polytheism did not come up in my work. It never has, because I'm interested in the Mahabharata, but I appreciate you, Ed, for making such a poignant, cogent argument in your book about what polytheism can teach us about humanities. Now, we've all just been happily agreeing with each other, so I'm going to throw something which challenges you, Ed, just to wake up everyone. So what if I said, I do not agree that we should search for and come to a new definition of what humans are, but we should in fact resist all definitions of what humans are, and resisting that anthropocentricity or resisting that definition of a human is perhaps the wisdom of the ancient world. Perhaps we should transcend that that need for defining ourselves in the space of things in our existence. So what would you say to that?
I would be in total agreement, because when I speak about the potential of a becoming humane of the humanities, so to speak, the cost of admission, so to speak, would be relinquishing any kind of a definition of the human, any possibility of that. Because I think that any definition of the human is an instrumentalization of actual humans. Yes. And that's the problem.
And it's classificatory, right? I mean, once you classify humans, then you have to put them either above the gods or below the gods, or above the animals or below the animals. And this above and below, I think, which classificatory systems open up, is best abandoned for a deeper reflection on what I am able to understand about my being, and without
to me, the only place for a discourse about what is the human is going to be within a tradition where that answer is going to be narrative. It's going to be a story. It's not going to be what we call a scientific discourse. But I mean, I'd also like to take back the value of the notion of science. To return to a notion of science that's grounded in antiquity, and that I think isn't about instrumentalization. Ultimately,
I got it. I just wanted to be provocative and challenge you and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't agree with you. Okay.
We have only a few minutes, but I want to sort of ask a provocative question of Ed. When you said, a sense of the human that is grounded in narrative and not classification, I agreed with you, because it's now recognized in scholarship on race that they were all in some way in dialogue with Carolus Linnaeus, the father of the whole taxonomic system that we know of, the animal and kingdom and so on, species, genera. And there were attempts to sort of take that and extend it to the human and produce the 5 different types for Blumenbach of humans and so on. And so it seemed like I agreed with you that that classificatory approach is problematic and we need something narrative, for example, the Mahabharata or the Odyssey or even Greek tragedy really reveal something about the human to us in a way that these inane classificatory things don't. And then I thought Schlegel tells you a narrative about, in narrative form, that there is one divine God-given race that sort of lived up in the central part of Asia and the Pamir Knot or something, and move from there. And it's recounted as a narrative of how this one group of people spread out and gave knowledge to the rest of the world.
It's a meta-narrative, though, really, because it's a narrative which seeks to subordinate other narratives and traditions to its superior explanatory value. Okay. And that's the difference. That's what we won't find if we want to draw this kind of distinction in primary narratives as opposed to meta-narratives. Ultimately, I would say that meta-narratives aren't really narratives in the sense that is truly meaningful, because they're not doing the kind of existential work that narrative truly is. But Vish wanted to say
another problem with the word meta-narrative. It has been applied, I think, rather religiously to Hegel's narrative and the word meta-narrative. So I would prefer the word superseding narrative.
Yes.
So it's a narrative that meta means the same thing. Narrative. Yeah. So a supersessionist narrative. So we should be alert to narratives.
This is where we get to the heart of the kind of genealogical inquiry that would place the original move of supersession, which I would argue the original move of supersession in history is the attempted Christian supersession of Judaism, is then paradigmatic for a whole host of subsequent supersessionist moves throughout the history of Western thought that are of tremendous significance in the way that they then became implemented and exteriorized and rendered concrete.
Yeah, the only reason I had to speak against you, Ed, is because I wanted to reclaim the word meta for metaphysics.
That's right. That's right. That's right. The only legitimate use of that prefix.
One of the things I want to note is, because of the Schlegel narrative, it's not really supersessionistic. What it is working off of is the notion of a chosen people. There is one race that is sort of speaks the divine language, is given speech by God and intelligence by God. And then there's the other race, the Africans or the Ethiopians, who are excluded from rationality, and their language comes from imitating animals. So they only have animal sounds. And whenever you find grammar in Africa or civilization in Africa, he explains it as the colonizing effect of the Asiatic stock. So he says Egypt, clearly everything Egyptian is Indian. And the priests, a small group of Brahmins, went and established Egyptian civilization. I think what needs to be challenged is that notion of a chosen people, that somehow one group stands in some relation, because that is at the heart of race. Race is also ultimately a theological concept, that one group of people stands in a favored relation to God, which I think is the inverse of monotheism. It's sort of I don't know what the correct term would be, but
well, and I mean, one would also have to have a discussion about the different way in which this concept functions within Judaism, as opposed to the way that it functions.
Absolutely, I have to agree with you.
Yeah, because I mean, the entire operative profile of the concept really changes, because initially you're talking about a notion which isn't that much different than notions that many peoples have internal to their traditions, which simply speaks to the locative value, so to speak, that they place upon their tradition. And it's a way of underscoring that. Many peoples, of course, articulate their entire cosmogony in terms of the unique creation of themselves as a people. And so where it changes its sign, so to speak, is when it gets taken up into a form where it becomes applied punitively to the other. And that's really, I think that, Hari, did you have something that, I thought I saw you gesturing before. I was wondering if you had something that you wanted to add.
No, there's nothing I can add to this discussion. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank Vishwa and Joy for actually introducing Edward to Indic Academy. This was about 2 years ago that they introduced me to Edward. We had a few discussions, and earlier this year reached out to him about establishing the center, and he readily agreed. And since then, Vishwa and Joy, substantial work has progressed. We have given several fellowship grants. We've also started a Polytheism course, 101 course, which I think more than 35 students are participating. And this conference we have organized. So we have several initiatives that are coming along. And so I wanted to take this opportunity, since both of you are here, for introducing me to introducing Edward to Indic Academy. So, and we are going to publish this book shortly. We would have actually launched the book today, but we were talking about a book designer, and since we are later in this evening, we are having a session on polytheist art. I thought that maybe we should hold back and then get a polytheist artist to design the cover. Edward was mentioning one name. So we would be launching the book also formally again in due course of time. So and thank you once.
At that point, you have to get Ed to go to India and do a book tour.
Yes.
He doesn't fly. He doesn't fly.
Yes.
You don't fly, right, Ed?
No, Ed doesn't travel.
Well, and Vishwa,
I'm not unalterably opposed to it, but we're gonna take that one stage at a time.
Okay. It's not.
I want to thank both of you as well for introducing me to Hari, and for really getting this ball rolling that we're now able to observe at this point at a certain plateau 6 months down the line.
With a lot
accomplished. Pardon?
Friends have everything in common.
Friends things are held in common.
That's right.
That's the dialogue beginning Ophile Idre Pu de Kai Poten.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. We've opened up we've opened up an ancient Greek course.
All right. But Hari, you were saying something else. Wait, sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that since I'm here, perhaps around 15th November or so, I'll send out an invite, and Edward, you and me, we can meet for dinner in New York. So I'll send you an invite. So that will be very nice.
And anything, Hari, you need me to do, such as if you want to reshape this, my talk here into a kind of a forward for Ed's book or so, I would be happy to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But I will have to. There are 3 typos in it that I already noticed, and for all the names we have written, we would like to create a bibliography with it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will sign off. It's 11:35 p.m. for me.
Okay,
So,
Theanos, I enjoyed your sharing of your experiences. You might want to read the Mahabharata because it's full of a community of animals as well, in which, in fact, it is the war story of humans fighting and dying is told at a sacrifice in which snakes are being sacrificed. There's no such a sacrifice in Indian tradition, so it is meant to draw parallels to how the snakes themselves reveal something about the human world and its doomed apocalyptic fate, stemming mainly from human egoism or ahamkara. So on that note, I will just sign off.
I will also sign off. Good night,
Yes,
everyone.
Congratulations, Ed. Congrats.
Thank
Congrats,
you.
Ed, again.
Thank you both for attending. Thank you, Joy, even though it's late at night.
You're welcome.